You're watching Act.tv. I'm Julianna Forlano. Our next guest is freelance journalist Sasha Abramsky, who keeps a close eye on how the Trump administration works to deceive the public and distract from its failings, which are numerous. Sasha writes, and I quote, "If one were to graph Trump's behavior, the result would be clear. The longer he has exercised power, the more irresponsibly he has used it." Sasha's here with us to give us the update. Sasha, again, is a freelance journalist, teaches journalism at UC Davis. He writes the Signal Noise column twice a week for The Nation magazine, also has a regular column for Truthout, and he's been in The Atlantic, The New Yorker Online, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, everywhere you can get good, important information and thoughts. Sasha, thanks for joining us today.
Anytime.
So this is such an important topic. He comes out with conspiracy theories every 5 minutes. You recently wrote about him, Trump, we're talking about, obviously. You know, he came out with the one about the elderly man in Buffalo, the one who the police pushed to the ground and now has a brain injury. Can you talk about that and why it was alarming to you?
Well, I mean, it was alarming for so many reasons, but basically what happened was, in the middle of all these protests against police brutality, the police in Buffalo committed police brutality. And, you know, they were doing that all over the country. But the Buffalo case was particularly sort of shocking viscerally because it was a 75-year-old man. It was an old man, a peace activist, a man called Martin Gugino. And he'd been a peace activist for years with Catholic Worker. He'd been in the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-war movement. He's a pacifist, essentially. And he was at one of the protests against police brutality, and these heavily sort of geared up police pushed him to the ground very hard, and he fell and he hit his head on the sidewalk, and he was pretty seriously injured, and he ended up in hospital. And while he was lying in hospital, a very conservative conspiratorial news network that has sort of come out of nowhere and established its credentials as a sort of, you know, utterly pro-Trump propaganda outlet called One America News Network, published this sort of conspiracy theory out of thin air that said that this old man was actually an Antifa agent provocateur, and that he had set out to deliberately ensnare the police. He'd gone over to them and started trying to monitor their communications, and then he provoked them into attacking him. And then when they attacked him, he had sort of play acted his own injuries. He'd fallen harder than he needed to fall, and he sort of faked his own injuries designed to make the police look bad. Now, this was absurd, and every reputable news network shied away from it. But Trump saw a story about it, and he glommed on, because this seems to be his modus operandi. He trolls the internet. He conspiracy theories that fit his worldview, and when he finds one, he amplifies it. So that's exactly what he did last week. While this old man was lying in the hospital bed, recovering from brain injuries, the most powerful human being on earth used his public platform to smear a private citizen. And you ask why that's so dangerous. It speaks for itself. When somebody with the reach that Trump has, his tweets go out to tens of millions of people. When somebody with the reach Trump has both completely shreds any notion of truth and fairness, and also goes after a private citizen name, then we're in a world of utterly totalitarian politics. And that's why it's dangerous. And that's why, even though the temptation is, let's tune out, there's too much blather out there, Trump's just making noise again, it's all flatulence, we don't need to hear it. Yes, it's Trump farting in public. But unfortunately, when Trump sort of, you know, does that, the whole world has to listen because it comes with consequences.
Isn't that the truth? How can we parse out, you know, if we're not at home watching, you know, One America News Network, how can we parse out you know, not that Trump ever tells us the truth, but how can we parse out the conspiracy theories that are coming from the right wing?
You know, oftentimes it involves actually following the data, following the research. It involves, you know, looking at the scientific evidence around climate change, for example, you know, which is another area the right tends to denigrate using conspiracy theories. So oftentimes it really does just involve following the information. Sometimes it's not that complicated. Sometimes it's just the gut check. Does it really make sense that a skinny old man could be a Machiavellian, demonically powerful agent provocateur. Does this really pass the smell?
We're in like Tivas, you know?
The answer is no. You don't have to do a whole bunch of research to look at this and say, you know what, this isn't sitting right.
And how is he gonna, I mean, you saw the video of him getting pushed, having a head injury. How is he going to, you know, I mean, just the fact that Trump is so vicious saying, oh, he fell a little bit too hard. Well, that's because he's not 600 pounds, Donald. I mean, like, you know, like you are, you know what I mean? Like you can't, it's just insane. It's absolutely insane. And anyone who could
think about this, there are so many things insane with that, because first of all, you know, Trump is basically parsing whether or not the guy was pushed hard enough or too hard. But second of all, what he's really saying is, you know, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of good old fashioned police violence, as long as it's not too violent. That's what he's really saying. He's saying there's nothing wrong with pushing an old man to the ground. You know, it only becomes a problem if the old man fakes his injuries. You know, on every level, as I said, this just the smell test.
Sasha, I feel that it's a bit of signaling to right wingers that they can be and should be as violent as they want to, as long as someone is a liberal and likes peace. It's almost like he's signaling to unleash your own forces of violence. We just had Chris Hedges on, as you saw, who was talking about what he believes is, you know, increasing and impending sectarian violence that we're not going to get out of as a country. Your thoughts about how Trump's conspiracy theories add into this situation?
Well, look, whether or not we get out, I don't know the answer. I profoundly hope we do, because the consequences of spiraling into sectarian violence would be horrific. But there's no doubt that there is a section of the population that's primed for violence at this point. And there's a section of the population that takes its cues from Donald Trump, is heavily armed, you know, is increasingly functioning as a sort of paramilitary adjunct to Trump's politics. And, you know, we saw that in Michigan last month when armed militias invaded the Capitol building and threatened to lynch the governor. And, you know, unlike his response to the demonstrations these past few weeks, where Trump has said the thugs and criminals and need to be dominated and they need the military on the streets, when it came to militias, Trump's response was, they're good people, they're frustrated, cut a deal with them. That's signaling. The ghastly march to the church outside the White House weeks ago, when armed forces, essentially military forces, cleared the streets of peaceful demonstrators solely so that Trump could have this photo opportunity where he marches to this church, waves a Bible around, talks about the need for dominating the streets, and also, sort of apropos nothing, says, and I'm your law and order president, and I will defend your Second Amendment rights. Well, you know, the demonstrators weren't out on the streets calling for confiscation of guns. They were out on the streets calling for accountability in the criminal justice system. But Trump pivoted, and he started talking about gun ownership. And what he was really saying was, to my white, my conservative, my suburban audience, I'm your gun man, and you're my gun people. And, you know, it's that symbiotic relationship, the fact that you have a president willing to sort of flirt with violence, and you have a section of his followers willing to come on board and actually implement that violence. That's the scary tango that's being at the moment.
A question coming in from the chat. I think you touched on this a bit, but if you wanted to go deeper, from Lauren, has the right wing has weaponized conspiratorial thinking to discredit reality. How does this contribute to the structures of power and the rise of fascism in the US?
Now, Lauren, that's a great question, because the thing about running a complicated democratic society is it involves information flows that are rational. You know, it works to a point if we can all accept that 2 + 2 = 4. But if we have a wing of the public saying, I no longer accept that, that's a conspiracy, QAnon tells me 2 + 2 = 5. You know, as soon as we have that breakdown of fundamental rationality, it becomes really, really hard to organize society democratically, because you're no longer talking about an intellectual debate where, you know, if you like, the best person wins, the best idea wins. You're talking about a situation where increasingly conspiracists reject the parameters of the debate and basically say, you know what, it's our way or the highway. your idea that 2 + 2 = 4 is somehow infringing on my liberty, and I'm going to defend my liberty to say 2 + 2 = 5 at the point of a gun. And it's as soon as you sort of bring in that violence as a sort of adjunct to co-conspirator in the conspiracy theories, that's when everything becomes really dangerous. And so I do think that the more we go down this rabbit hole where, you know, a large part of the population, and it's not just conservatives, it's a large part of the population has begun embracing conspiracy theories. So you have anti-vaxxers, many of whom would sort of consider themselves politically progressive, firmly convinced there's a global conspiracy to poison young children with vaccines. You have people who believe that, you know, any discussion of climate change is a conspiracy to undermine the free market or as a Chinese hoax. You have, you know, these notions that gun massacres that we've seen are actually put on, that they're a show, that they're somehow fake, and that they've been put on by people solely as a way to gain control of other people's guns and to take away Second Amendment rights. You know, once you have that collapse of rationality into irrationality, really, really bad political consequences tend to follow. And not just in America. If you look at, you know, Nazi Germany, for example.
They provide a great example for everything. You know.
Unfortunately, they're the poster child for what happens when a major society goes nuts.
Exactly.
You know, what we saw in the 1930s was a collapse into deeply, deeply violent, conspiratorial, anti-democratic politics. And, you know, obviously history doesn't ever repeat itself exactly, but there's a variation on the melody at the moment. And what we're seeing is enough similarities in these authoritarian populist regimes, whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trump here or Modi in India, that they do bear some comparisons to what happened in fascist Europe, you know, 80, 90 years ago.
How would you, you write that, you know, that we defeat the politics of the big lie. I love that. Politics of the big lie, not by ignoring it, but by challenging each and every falsehood. There are so many, it's like impossible. Plus, those of us who want to challenge the falsehoods, like this one, we only have this outlet. We don't necessarily even have, you know, MSNBC. We have a shrinking amount of outlets, and the fact that the right wing, who are those right wing crazies on the internet, they kind of devalue the internet. So if you're hearing on the internet somebody else said this, you know, they're trying to poison your water with fluoride, and then over here they're saying you become of equal value to on the same, if you're on the same platform, to these nuts. How can we engage in exposing the truth given our media system now?
Well, I teach journalism, and one thing I always ask my students in the first class is, where do you get your news from? And a huge number of my students in week one of that class say, well, I only get my news from social media. So I get whatever the algorithm sends my way. And by the end of the class, 10 weeks later, I've, you know, convinced most of them that that's a pretty lousy way to get your news. Because the thing about, you know, only relying on social media is, A, you end up in your own echo chamber, because, you know, basically the way the algorithms work, they feed you stuff that, you know, the computers have realized you want to read. So B, A, you're in your own echo chamber, and B, it's actually a very limiting way of getting information, because you get the popular stories. You don't get the stuff that's behind the scenes that might actually be really quite important to helping you understand what's going on. And so, you know, I always tell my students, read broadly and also read deeply, and look for a variety of news outlets. Don't just go to social media. Don't just go to US news outlets. You know, see what the rest of the world's saying about us. If you read multiple languages, use those languages to get as many news sources as you can. But curiosity and skepticism are good antidotes to conspiracism, because conspiracy theories basically prey on the gullible, and it's a lazy way of getting information. You know, if something really complicated is happening, you know, there's a new virus, we don't understand quite how it works, we know it's very contagious, you know, it spreads very quickly. Well, how much easier is it if we could just dismiss the whole thing, either by saying it's a hoax or by saying it's caused by 5G networks? which is one of the conspiracies doing the rounds about coronavirus. Well, it's not caused by 5G networks, and it's not a hoax. It's a real virus. But to actually understand how it works, you have to do a bit of reading, and you have to read some scientific literature, and you have to be sort of curious and get your information from many sources. So I would say, the antidote is don't be lazy. And that goes for whether you define yourself as left-wing or right-wing or liberal or conservative. Don't be lazy in how you get the news.
Right, but I can read news all day long. I just can't do that. You know what I mean? It's become inherent. It's become just another thing that one has to do. I can't parse through I'm talking for other people. This is my job, so we parse through. But I can't parse through, your average citizen has to be marching in the street, calling their senator, feeding their kids, worrying about their health insurance, and parsing through news so they can have some idea of what the hell's going on. It seems like
I'm going to push you back on that, Julianna. We did it last. It's only in the last few years that people have stopped reading newspapers. If you having this conversation 20 or 30 years ago, any commuter on a public transit system, if you'd gone to the New York public, the New York Metro, you've gone to London Underground, you've gone to the Paris Metro, whatever it would be. If you go to any big city, you would have seen commuters reading the newspaper. And it was considered a worthy investment of one's morning. Or people would get home delivery of the newspaper and they'd sit at home and they'd read it. Or they'd buy general interest news magazines like Time and so on. It's only in the last few years that we've assumed, A, that news should be quick and easily digestible, and B, that it should be free. And, it's that combination, the fact we're no longer willing to pay to invest in news, to a degree that is, us opting out of a complicated system and saying we want to do it quick and we want to do it on the cheap. And so I do think you can sort of push people a bit and say, you know what, you're willing to invest half an hour sitting at a Starbucks having a coffee, and while you're there, you sort of go around on your cell phone. Instead of that, why don't you actually look at news sites for a little bit? Whether it's online or whether it's physical doesn't really matter. But unless we invest that time and energy in understanding the world we're a part of, we're going to have no way to get out of this spread of conspiracy theory as a way of understanding the world, because conspiracy theory is basically a dumbed down understanding of how history works or how society works or how all the complicated interlocking parts of an economy function.
Don't you think that the fact that, say, the New York Times publishes stories like, yeah, we should go to war, they have weapons of mass destruction, or the fact that when you brought up the vaccines, it's like people who are upset about the vaccines are really upset about the lack of transparency and, the corporations making money off something that they consider may be unsafe and having no recourse to find out more about that. Don't you think that? Yeah, it seems like it's.
I think, if you have a media system that has, dropped the ball many, many times, and if you have an economy that's opaque, and if you have a political system that, manifestly is skewed towards the rich, the powerful, the influential, all of that is disempowering. All of that sort of tells ordinary people, you're not part of the process. But in telling people you're not part of the process, what it does is it pushes people out to the margins, and the explanations that people tend to grasp for, oftentimes there's a conspiracy element to it. So you're absolutely right. There are a whole bunch of institutions that should and could be reformed, and there are a whole bunch of power structures that, absolutely have to be reformed if democracy is to function properly. But that still doesn't mean that conspiracies are the best way of understanding how human society operates.
Certainly not.
We're too messy. Our societies are too messy to be neatly defined by conspiracies. It's this sort of X-Man vision of, the X-Files vision of life, that there are a few super powerful people behind the scenes pulling the strings, and all of us are just puppets. And we're not. We are autonomous human beings, and when we come together and we make political change through mass mobilization, such as what we've seen this week, extraordinary things can and do happen. But if we just retreat behind our sort of barricades and say it's all about conspiracy, in actual fact, that's extraordinarily disempowering.